Hi, this is Misha, and as I said in our British L1A1 video, we've been asked to do more FAL vids, but there hasn't really been much new out, but I thought we would just revisit really one of my favorites, the Israeli FAL. I've got my light barrel here, which is basically just an early FN 50.00. And of course we've got the really more common heavy barrel here, which is a version of the early 50.42. Now, Israel adopted both of these at the same time. Early on, after independence and the official establishment of the IDF, 1948, Israel was using whatever they could get their hands on. A lot of Mausers, which we have quite an in-depth video on the Israeli Mauser. If you'd like to see that, check out the playlist. Lots of submachine guns, early Sten guns, and they kind of made their own cobbled together copies of the Sten gun in Israel. And then, of course, the very famous Uzi came out. Really, beginning in 51, officially adopted 53, 54 at that time frame. And, of course, again, we have a video on the history of that in our thing. At the same time, Israel needed something new and modern. It really was one of the first nations to adopt FN's FAL, which FN had been working on really kind of a little bit before World War II, and then really resumed development right after the war. By 52, they had working prototypes, and by 53, the FAL was available for purchase by militaries. These are the early versions. Famously, Canada was the first to officially adopt the FAL as the C1 in 1954, but it would actually take some time for this to be set up. Another early adopter was Argentina, but again, it took time to set that up. Israel, on the other hand, adopted in 1955 this version of the FAL, and by 1956, it was deploying the military service. The Suez Crisis that year saw limited deployment of Israel's FAL. The light barrel version is known as the Romat, which is essentially kind of a word salad combination of Hebrew words meaning self-loading rifle. It has the typical 21-inch barrel, firing 7.62 NATO. It has an early kind of version of the gas system, which today we call an Israeli pattern, because it's not exactly metric, but it's definitely not inch either. It's its own thing, because it was based on, like I said, early designs. But it did use kind of unique handguards, which were a takeoff from what we would know as the T-48. The early FN handguards were all wood. Well, these replaced the front thin wood portion, kind of known for being fragile, with metal heat shields. And then there's heat shields continuing under the cylindrical handguard, which is wood with, like I said, steel under it. And then quite uniquely, we have these donuts on top here. These are spacers to keep the wood from getting crushed together and leaving the gas tube exposed for cooling and for cool points. I'm sure the aesthetics were highly important to the IDF in the 50s. The original guns were very close to FN's earlier guns. They would have the tall sights, much like you would find on the L1A1 or the C1. FN wouldn't actually go to the shorter sights until the West German guns. We had wood stocks. Now this is a type C stock with the ferrule, but there were plenty of Israeli guns with A and B stocks. They did not have a cleaning compartment in the butt, just a steel butt plate. Pretty typical pistol grip. And again, the first Israeli guns were all FN produced in Belgium. It's interesting, it's been said anecdotally that one of the key things was FN kind of hooked Israel up with the FAL and in exchange, Israel hooked FN up with the Uzi, but I've never found substantiating evidence of this, but it's kind of a cool story because FN definitely produced the Uzi under a license. Well, to go with the light barrel infantry gun, we have the heavy barrel, which is known as the Makleon. Again, more Hebrew words, essentially meaning automatic rifle. This was intended as a light machine gun, or SAW, kind of a replacement for the BAR. We still have a 21-inch barrel, but it's much heavier, especially under the handguard. Still heavy out here. As you see, we have a bipod. Now, unlike the FN gun, which had a forged machine steel bipod, this one's actually really, really thick stamped steel, hollow, so it's a little cheaper to produce. It does fold up here. Yeah, this gun is heavy. Droop, like so. And it is detachable for transport. There's just one giant screw with a big flathead, as you see, holding it on to this collar. But that's easily removed if you get into vehicles or whatnot. And I've got a pouch over here for it. Here it is. Soldiers would actually carry it in this. The bipod can fit in this pouch here. This is an Israeli pouch. Pretty neat. And it's very easy to attach once you hit the ground. This bipod actually couples to this extended flash hider. It's a birdcage style, kind of based on the Type B. Back here, we've got the tall front sight. The handguards are very similar. Two-piece design, but because of the heavier barrel, they're a little wider. We only have the one spacer, and instead of being a full donut, it only goes about halfway and actually clips in versus being actually on the gas tube. To better compensate for the weight out front, the carry handle is reversed, pointing forward versus back, so you're carrying it right above the chamber area versus above the receiver. And moving back, one change that the Israelis did, the standard rear sight was 600 meter for the light machine gun. This is a 700 meter, so it goes forward a little further. You notice this stock does not have the ferrule. I haven't seen an Israeli light machine gun stock with the ferrule. And this does have kind of a flip-up butt plate, reminiscent of, well, the M14 is often cited, but also the BM59 and many others actually use a flip-up butt plate. But that was, again, to use it as a light machine gun more effectively. Whoop. Now, I have the 30-round mag in this. Why not? Light machine gun. There is no real clear source saying that Israel used 30-round mags. It looks like they mostly used 20s, but, you know, Israel had a little bit of everything. I wouldn't be surprised if they had some of the 30s, because Belgium definitely did. This one here has the standard 20, and this is an Israeli mag. It's also an Israeli sling. You notice it's very similar to a FAL, an infield sling. This one has the same pattern as sling, but it's longer for a light machine gun. Now, IMI, Israel Military Industries, never made complete FALs in Israel, but they started to make more and more parts for replacements, and eventually FN would just send them receivers and possibly barrels, and they would make the rest. This front sight is a very iconic IMI part, and it's very unique to the Israeli FAL. You see it's solid with kind of a hexagonal side. If you see an Israeli gun with an open ear front sight base, as this one has here, that means it has the FN. If you see this, that means it has the Israeli. Also, the carry handles would change. The original ones would be the standard FAL. The Israeli made ones, this polymer is actually molded on to the rod. It doesn't rotate. See? Another thing that Israel did that was pretty unique, the cocking handle works as a forward assist. When you press it in, it locks to the carrier, meaning you can force the bolt forward or back manually. Otherwise, it's of course non-reciprocating like other FALs. And also, while the original light barrels were select fire, quickly they decided to make a special selector that would only do safe and semi. There's a little tab up here that does not allow it to go into the full auto right here. You notice the Israeli selector is a little different too. Kind of this extra arm, unlike other FALs. The mag catch is a little different too. It has this hole in it. Like I said, the Israeli guns kind of have a unique pattern to them. And the heavy barrel will get many of the same changes, including the different gas block as time would go on, but they would keep on using the birdcage flash hider. However, with the light barrel, notice there's not much on this here barrel. The original FAL pattern was just bare. That's correct. This isn't a band model or anything, but you see this lug under here. Well, the idea, that let us use a few different devices. Grab them over here for you. First, we've got a grenade launcher here that can go onto that lug with a little plunger. It even has its own sights, if I can remember how these flip up. There we go. Rifle sights for use. 22 millimeter. These are most commonly used with the AT-52 rifle grenade, which Israel was very fond of. So that was one unit that could be issued with and used on. But much more common is this here bayonet. Notice these forks. It's a very interesting bayonet, quite unique. Goes onto the lug like most bayonets do. Come on there. See that? See? What happens when you have these forks on and the blade, they make kind of a three-lug situation or a three-prong, which you might start to see resembles a flash hider. This is where your flash hider came from, was the bayonet, because this was meant to have the bayonet more or less always on the gun. Knowing that having a bayonet thrown on could affect the point of aim, what they did, they had a spring mechanism built in to the handle, so when the gun would recoil, the bayonet would actually move with the theory of it not affecting that point of impact. Kind of interesting, very vintage bayonet. Now, that was the original pattern. Israel would eventually go to the FN kind of 22 millimeter barrel style, the round cylindrical thing, combination device, actually quite early on, adopting an early version of that. So after that was adopted, they would start threading the barrels and screwing it on, and then the lug would disappear from later Israeli barrels. Now, interestingly, there is actually a transitional period where you can have a gun with the lug and the compensator put on, but yeah. As I said, these guns would first see use during the Suez Crisis. Pretty limited use, but they were there. They were in full-fledged use by the 6 Days War in 1967. This is a 2-cell Israeli mag pouch. Pretty simple. For any of you who have Uzi mags, you'll recognize this general style of pouch. And it was still in use in 1973 by the Yom Kippur War. But the gun always was pretty susceptible to sand, dirt, dust, everything that the desert could throw at it. Now, to be fair, by the standards of the 1950s and even 60s, every gun known to exist at the time was susceptible. But by the 70s, new patterns of gun were coming on to the market and becoming well known. They were better resistant to the desert. The AK-47 AKM is definitely one of these. Israeli soldiers would have captured quite a few thousands, tens of thousands of AKs and AKMs from the Palestinians, the Egyptians, from lots of different sources. And by the Yom Kippur War, they were actually kind of ditching their issued FALs and using the AK-47. Some IDF soldiers were so desperate they were even ditching the FAL for an Uzi. So this is where the Galil kind of comes into play, which is based on the AK. And the Galil was originally designed and developed to replace the Israeli FAL, both the Romat and the Makleon. That's why the original Galil ARM is kind of a half infantry rifle, half light machine gun. Now that's a story for a different video, and as usual, you know the mantra by now, we have a history video on the Galil, so check the playlist. It took time to get the Galil into action, and by that point the M16 was also coming online, and US Uncle Sugar, as people call us, was giving Israel a lot of free ARs. So by the early 80s, the FAL was being greatly phased out and replaced by both the Galil and then the M16. So IMI would kind of wrap up parts production by this point, and then the FAL be pulled from service. They did try to keep it around a little longer. They tried putting sand cuts in the bolt carrier and stuff, but it was just, these guns regardless were, though very modern when first adopted in 55, by say 70, 75, they were dated. We have a steel and wood gun, heavy, long, hard to get in and out of vehicles with. Again, they restricted the light rifle to semi only, because only 20 round mags, and we're shooting 7.62 NATO besides. The ammo itself was heavy. They didn't ever have a folding stock version. And the light machine gun was guilty of all those sins, plus it was even heavier, and it wasn't as reliable as the light barrel. They had problems with jamming on the second or third shot. This is a well-known issue with the FALO. Some people like to blame the magazine for it. The thing is, if Israel didn't issue the 30-round mag, how could the Israeli FAL experience the same jamming problem? So either reports of this one jamming on the third round are incorrect, or reports of it being blamed with the magazine are incorrect. And of course, it was even harder to get in and out of vehicles, and we didn't have the quick change barrel. This barrel was very much fixed in place. So it was just dated. But while that was the end of service for Israel, this is where these two guns come into the US specifically. These are both pre-banned guns from the 1980s. This here is an Arms Corps import from Israel. In 1987, a company called Onyx worked with an Israeli company called Stutzner's Brothers Limited, SBL, to produce semi-auto FALs for the U.S. civilian market. Essentially what they did, they grabbed surplus, no longer needed Israeli FAL guns from the IDF or IMI parts, whatever, parts where they could, and they combined them with receiver forgings that Israel just had laying around from FN. These forgings were technically incomplete because they just came over from FN as raw forgings. So SBL would finish them out as semi-autos, including putting in a semi-auto ejector block. And so we have an all-Israeli gun imported in 87 and 88 by Onyx, and even has a Star of David. Now these are interesting because the receivers are a few different patterns. They have basically this kind of hybrid of a Type 1, which has the full lightning cut in the back, but then the lightning cut's kind of simplified on the magwell here. There's also more of a Type 3 where this is not lightning cut back here. But in 88, Onyx went out of business, but luckily Arms Corps took over and continued to import the SBL Israeli guns. until, of course, 89 and the ban that came through, and then these were shut down. And that was pretty much the end of the light barrel. Now, interestingly, not many light barrel kits have ever appeared on the American market, which leads some to believe that Israel either kept them in reserve longer or sold them off to an interested nation, because you see light barrel kits, but just not as frequently. But you do see, and have seen for a very long time, a ton of heavy barrel kits, because apparently Israel really liked the FALO, the heavy barrel, because they made a lot of these. This gun here is actually a Springfield put together. Now, Onyx and Arms Corps did have SBL put a few heavy barrels together on their receivers, but they're very uncommon today. These are much more common, these Springfield SAR-48 match guns. They took kits directly out of Israel. They bought them surplus out of Israel in the 80s. And then they assembled them on Brazilian MBEL forged receivers here in the U.S. Kind of same thing that they did with the BM59s, but those are built on Beretta receiver forgings. These are on MBEL. So they look a little weird, being a Type 3, which wasn't something Israel really ever did. But since this is a machine gun type gun, having the extra strength of not only a Type 3, but a forged Type 3 to boot is kind of good. The only thing they had to really kind of monkey with, since the Israeli guns were the early pattern, the barrel pitch, the barrel threading was a little different from the later guns like the MBEL, so they had to modify the thread lockup for the barrel and receiver to make the barrels time in properly. But these are more common. They're kit guns, but they are pre-ban kit guns, so that's pretty cool. And that's a good way to get a Israeli heavy barrel that's all Israeli except for the receiver. And Springfield did a great job with them. And both of these guns, the Arms Corps Onyx and the Springfield, were priced pretty reasonably back in the 80s. They were definitely much cheaper than the Israeli guns, than the Belgian guns. So a lot of people went for them when they wanted more of a shooter. Plus, they liked that these were both built from essentially surplus parts. I mean, reconditioned, perhaps reparkerized metal or redone wood, but still battlefield parts, which is kind of neat, whereas the FN guns of the era were commercial parts. Actually, I first saw a light barrel at my friend's, the mechanical engineer I've referred to from time to time. He bought a light barrel, very identical to this, except his has the extended, the 22 millimeter combo device on the end. He bought it brand new back in, I think, 1989, maybe 1988, because he thought it was interesting and it was so much cheaper than the FN offering, and he still has it. Ironically, it's not really his favorite FAL because it's not the most accurate, and accuracy is very important to him, but he keeps it because of its history and, you know, it has some personal significance. Although I tried to buy it off of him for years and years until I finally ran across this one. The heavy barrel here I picked up locally. It just really appeared in a local newspaper, and the guy wanted a very reasonable sum for it, so we drove and picked it up, and I've had it ever since. So these are still available, and there are plenty of parts kits out there that people have built up using these kits, and they're also very good. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed revisiting the Israeli FAL. I think they're neat. They're their own pattern, kind of their own thing. Very heavy. If you have your own, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. I'm sure some of you do. And if you're interested in kind of Israeli history and all that, please do check out our playlist for the other guns mentioned and others besides, like the Tavor. And if we ever do get some new FALs in, I promise you, we will show them. Helps if I take the safety out, huh? If you like, please click like, and if you really like, please click on the link and check out our Patreon page. This is Misha, and we will catch you next time.